History is written by the victors, but the truth is buried in the ashes of the victims. For decades, we have been told a comfortable lie about the Second World War. We were told that the horrors of the Nazi regime were the work of a few madmen at the top. A small Kapolster by Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich, who operated in the shadows while ordinary German soldiers simply fought for their country. But history has a terrifying way of refusing to stay buried. When you strip away the propaganda, the military marshes, and the polished brass of the Iron Crosses, you are left with a reality so cold, so systematic, and so profoundly evil that it challenges everything we believe about human nature. What happens when an entire modern society turns mass murder into a bureaucratic science? What happens when ordinary family men, school teachers, clerks, and factory workers are given a uniform, a rifle, and the absolute authority to wipe entire populations off the face of the earth? The story of Nazi war crimes is not just a story of battlefield losses or political madness. It is a chronicle of a dark, infectious ideology that turned doctors into executioners, soldiers into butchers, and an entire nation into a machinery of death. This is not the clean history of textbooks. This is the raw, unvarnished truth of the massacres, the cover-ups, and the terrifying realization that the monsters we fear are not born in darkness. They are made by us. To truly understand how a civilized nation in the heart of Europe descended into unparalleled savagery, we have to look past the grand strategies of generals and look into the eyes of the men who pulled the triggers. We must travel to the frozen fields of Belgium, to the forgotten ravines of Ukraine, and to the quiet villages of Italy, where the concept of mercy was completely obliterated. We must examine the psychology of the killers and the agonizing final moments of the innocent, because the moment we forget how easily a human being can be stripped of their humanity is the exact moment history begins to repeat itself. The descent into madness did not begin on the battlefields of 1939. It began years earlier, in the minds of a generation traumatized by defeat and poisoned by a myth. Following the First World War, a shattered Germany clung to a dangerous lie known as the stab-in-the-back myth. The radical right, led by a rising demagogue named Adolf Hitler, convinced millions that their imperial army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within by socialists, communists, and Jews. This lie was a potent psychological drug. It transformed a national humiliation into a burning desire for vengeance. It gave ordinary citizens a scapegoat for their economic misery and paved the way for the total militarization of society. When the Nazi Party seized power in January 1933, they did not just change the government. They re-engineered the human soul through organizations like the Hitler Youth. Children were systematically trained to view war not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate test of manhood. They were taught that compassion was a weakness, that empathy was a disease, and that the ultimate virtue was absolute obedience to the state. Boys practiced military drills, handled weapons, and were fed a steady diet of racial supremacy. They were told that they were the master race, the Aryans, and that all other peoples, especially the Slavs of Eastern Europe, and the Jews were subhumans, who existed only to be conquered or destroyed. By the time Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, an entire generation of young men had been psychologically weaponized. They did not see the invasion as an act of naked aggression. They saw it as a holy crusade to reclaim Germany's rightful place in the world. And from the very first hours of the conflict, the line between military combat and mass murder was completely erased. The invasion of Poland was not a conventional war. It was the testing ground for a new type of conflict, a war of annihilation. Behind the advancing tanks of the regular German army came a specialized force of terror known as the Einsatzgruppen, the specialized SS death squads. Their mission was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly precise: to eliminate anyone who might lead a resistance against German occupation. This meant the systematic execution of Polish intellectuals, politicians, professors, doctors, and priests in cities and towns across Poland. Prominent citizens were rounded up based on prepared lists, marched into nearby forests, and shot in the back of the neck. Heinrich Himmler, the SS, watched these early executions with a cold, calculating eye. He understood that to carry out a campaign of total conquest, his men had to be stripped of their remaining moral constraints. He openly praised his troops for their toughness, telling them that they had to have the stomach to carry out deeds that would soon be forgotten. He acknowledged that hauling away crying women, separating families, and executing thousands of innocent people caused psychological trauma for his soldiers. But instead of halting the slaughter, the Nazi leadership viewed this trauma as a sacrifice the soldiers were making for the fatherland. The killers were taught to view their own feelings of guilt not as a warning from their conscience, but as a weakness they had to overcome. As the occupation tightened, the terror expanded from political targets to the vulnerable and the helpless. In late 1939, the Nazi regime initiated a secret program codenamed Action T4. This was a state-sponsored euthanasia campaign designed to cleanse German society of those they deemed burdens on the state: the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and children with genetic conditions. In psychiatric hospitals across occupied territories, patients were led into specially prepared rooms. The doors were sealed, and poison gas was pumped inside. High-ranking officers, including a young and ambitious SS adjutant named Joachim Peiper, stood outside these rooms, looking through plexiglass windows to observe the efficiency of the killing method. They watched with scientific detachment as human beings laughed and talked in their final moments of confusion before collapsing onto the straw-covered floors under the influence of the gas. This program was crucial for the Nazi regime. It was the technological and psychological bridge that connected individual executions to the industrial scale slaughter of the Holocaust. The gas chambers that would later define the death camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka were born in the psychiatric wards of the T4 program. The true scale of the Nazi war. Machines' capacity for horror was unleashed. In the summer of 1941, with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, this was the conflict Hitler had dreamed of for decades. It was a racial war against what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, a campaign explicitly designed to clear the vast lands of Eastern Europe for German colonization. Before the first shot was fired, German commanders were issued the infamous Commissar order. This directive instructed the military to immediately execute any captured Soviet political officers without trial. It was a direct violation of international law. A green light from the highest. Levels of command at the standard. Rules of warfare did not apply on the Eastern Front, as the German army pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Einsatzgruppen followed closely behind, turning the beautiful landscapes of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia into a vast, open-air slaughterhouse. The methods were brutal in their simplicity. In every captured town and village, the Jewish population and suspected partisans were ordered to assemble. Under the pretense of resettlement, they were forced to hand over their valuables, strip naked, and march to the edges of massive ravines or trenches they had often been forced to dig themselves. One of the most horrific examples of this mass slaughter occurred in late September 1941 at a ravine called Babi Yar, just outside the city of Kyiv, in a span of just 2 days. Over 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were systematically murdered by a small detachment of SS men and their collaborators. The victims were marched into the ravine in small groups, forced to lie down on top of the bodies of those who had been killed before them, and shot in the back of the head. The killers worked in shifts, pausing for lunch and cigarette breaks while the air grew thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. For miles around, the ground literally shook as hundreds of thousands of tons of earth were bulldozed over the writhing mass of the dead and the dying. This was the Holocaust by bullets. It was a face-to-face, intimate form of mass murder that required the killers to look into the eyes of their victims before pulling the trigger. And as the weeks turned into months, the Nazi leadership realized that this method was taking a heavy psychological toll on their men. Officers complained of alcoholism, nervous breakdowns, and severe depression among the executioners. The solution was not to stop the killing, but to mechanize it, to create a system where the killers could be emotionally detached from the act of death. This led to the development of mobile gas vans, where victims were packed into the back of airtight trucks and suffocated by the vehicle's exhaust fumes as it drove through the countryside, arriving at mass graves with a cargo of corpses. On the battlefields of the Eastern Front, military units began to develop a culture of extreme violence that blurred the line between anti-partisan operations and outright slaughter. Units like the 1st SS Panzer Division gained a reputation for unmatched ferocity in combat, but their victories were accompanied by a trail of scorched earth. In February 1943, during the fierce fighting around the city of Kharkov, a German unit commanded by Joachim Peiper suffered casualties in a minor skirmish near a small Soviet village. When the German troops entered the village and discovered the bodies of their fallen comrades, their response was immediate and merciless. Peiper ordered his men to burn the entire village to the ground and execute every single inhabitant. His troops earned a terrifying nickname that would follow them for the rest of the war. The Blowtorch Battalion. They swept through the region, torching villages and slaughtering hundreds of civilians. In one single action, over 200 people, including women and children, were locked inside a local church before the building was doused in fuel and set ablaze. The soldiers stood outside with machine guns, cutting down anyone who tried to escape through the windows. For these actions, for his bold and unorthodox leadership, Peiper was not court-martialed. He was awarded the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in Nazi Germany. The state did not just tolerate mass murder, it rewarded it. By 1943, the tide of the war began to turn. The catastrophic defeat of the German army at Stalingrad and the massive tank battles at Kursk shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. As the Red Army began its relentless drive westward, the German military was forced to retreat. But their retreat was marked by an escalation of terror. Units were redeployed from the Eastern Front to other occupied territories to suppress the growing resistance. Movements that were destabilizing the Nazi grip on Europe. In the late summer of 1943, following the surrender of fascist Italy to the Allies, German forces rushed to occupy northern and central Italy. They established a brutal puppet state under a rescued Benito Mussolini and immediately faced a fierce, highly organized partisan resistance. The response of the German military occupation was a campaign of collective punishment designed to terrorize the civilian population into submission. The rule was simple. For every German soldier killed by partisans, a multiple of Italian civilians would pay with their lives. In September 1943, in the quiet northern Italian town of Bovs, a brief firefight between German troops and partisan guerrillas resulted in the capture of 2 German soldiers. Joachim Peiper and his Blowtorch Battalion were called in to handle the situation. Peiper positioned his heavy weapons around the town and threatened to completely destroy Bovs if his men were not released. The local parish priest, Giuseppe Bernardi, and a prominent businessman named Antonio Vassallo stepped forward to act as negotiators. They courageously traveled into the mountains, convinced the partisans to release the German prisoners, and brought them back safely to Peiper's lines. Peiper had given his word that if the prisoners were returned unharmed, the town would be spared. But the concept of honor had long been discarded by the SS. The moment the German soldiers were secure, Peiper broke his promise. He ordered his men to open fire on the town with artillery and heavy machine guns. The parish priest and the businessman who had risked their lives to negotiate the peace were seized by the soldiers, doused with petrol and burned alive in the middle of the street. The soldiers then systematically moved from house to house, setting fire to over 300 buildings. They showed no mercy to the vulnerable. An 87-year-old woman who was paralyzed and unable to leave her bed was burned alive. Inside her home, a disabled veteran was shot dead as he tried to crawl through a field to escape the flames. Even a deaf-mute man who attempted to put out a fire on his property was executed on the spot. In total, 23 innocent civilians were massacred in Bovs that day. It was a stark demonstration that the violence perfected on the Eastern Front had now been brought to Western Europe. As the Allies advanced on all fronts, the Nazi regime grew increasingly desperate. In June 1944, the massive Allied landings in Normandy opened a definitive Western Front. The German military found itself caught in a vice, squeezed between the unstoppable advance of the Soviet Red Army from the east and the American, British, and Canadian forces from the west. The physical and psychological pressure on the German troops was immense. Many units had been fighting continuously for years, suffering catastrophic casualties and witness to unimaginable horrors. They were exhausted, traumatized, and deeply cynical. Their world was collapsing, and their adherence to Nazi ideology transformed their desperation into fanatical rage. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final, desperate gamble in the West the Ardennes Offensive, popularly known as the Battle of the Bulge. The goal was to launch a surprise armored strike through the dense forests of Belgium, split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Hitler explicitly told his generals that this offensive must be conducted with an aura of terror, that the enemy must be broken not just militarily, but psychologically. The spearhead of this massive offensive was entrusted to Kampfgruppe Peiper, a heavily armed armored column led by the now infamous Joachim Peiper. His men were ordered to advance with maximum speed, bypassing enemy strongpoints and ignoring standard tactical constraints. In the chaos of the winter offensive, with freezing temperatures and dense fog, the thin line between combat and atrocity vanished once again. On the morning of December 17th, 1944, a small American convoy belonging to the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was moving south through the Belgian countryside near the town of Malmedy. They were standard support troops, not frontline infantry. Suddenly, the spearhead of Peiper's armored column slammed into the convoy. The lightly armed Americans stood no chance against the massive Tiger and Panther tanks. After a brief, chaotic exchange of fire, the American soldiers panicked, realized their situation was hopeless, and raised their hands in surrender. The German soldiers rounded up the prisoners, searched them, and confiscated their personal possessions. Approximately 120 American soldiers were marched into a snow-covered field at a crossroads known as Bognes. They stood in the freezing wind, their hands raised, waiting to be processed as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention. But the men of the SS did not recognize the Geneva Convention. Without warning, an SS officer drew his pistol and fired directly into the standing crowd of prisoners, killing an American medical officer. Instantly, heavy machine guns mounted on the nearby German vehicles opened fire on the helpless men. The field erupted into a scene of absolute slaughter. The heavy rounds tore through human flesh, knocking men down into the snow. In a panic, some soldiers attempted to run toward the nearby woods, but they were cut down by crossfire. Most dropped where they stood, piled on top of one another in the freezing mud. After the initial barrage of machine gun fire ceased, the field fell deathly quiet, except for the groans of the wounded. But the atrocity was not over. The SS soldiers casually walked into the field, moving among the heaps of bleeding bodies. They used their rifles and pistols to systematically shoot any survivors who showed signs of life, delivering a final bullet to the head at point-blank range. A group of Americans had managed to flee the field and hide inside a small cafe at the crossroads. The German soldiers pursued them, blocked the exits, set the building on fire, and shot every single man who tried to escape the burning structure. When the armored column finally moved on, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the snow. A little over 40 men managed to survive the massacre by pretending to be dead for hours beneath the frozen corpses of their friends, before escaping into the forest under the cover of darkness. The Malmedy Massacre was not an isolated incident. Over the next 4 days, as Peiper's unit pushed deeper into Belgium, they committed a succession of atrocities. executing over 350 American prisoners of war and more than 100 Belgian civilians, including women and young children, in towns like Stavelot, Troymport, and Lignouville. The violence was contagious, a collective expression of a military unit that had completely detached itself from civilization. But the Nazi war machine could not alter the laws of mathematics or logistics. The Ardennes offensive failed. The Allied lines held, reinforcements poured into the region, and Kampfgruppe Peiper ran out of fuel, battered by air strikes and surrounded by American forces. Peiper was forced to abandon his heavy tanks and lead the remnants of his men on a foot retreat back to the German border. The great gamble had failed, and the end was now in sight. In May 1945, the Third Reich finally collapsed. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker in Berlin, and the remaining German military forces surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war was over, but the monumental task of uncovering the truth was just beginning. As Allied troops liberated the concentration camps and advanced through occupied territories, they uncovered the physical evidence of crimes that defied human imagination. They found mass graves, ash-filled pits, gas chambers, and millions of starved, brutalized survivors. The international community realized that standard legal frameworks were insufficient to address the scale of these atrocities. This led to the establishment of the Nuremberg trials and a series of subsequent military tribunals designed to bring the perpetrators of Nazi war crimes to justice. In May 1946, the United States military convened a special war crimes trial at the former Dachau concentration camp. Sitting in the dock were 73 former members of the Waffen-SS, including Joachim Peiper, all charged with the murders of American soldiers and Belgian civilians during the Battle of the Bulge. The trial, controversial and revealing, the prosecution presented forensic evidence from the snow-covered fields of Malmedy and the agonizing testimony of the American survivors. During his interrogations, Peiper remained unrepentant, revealing his deep, unwavering commitment to the Nazi ideology. When asked about his views on the Jewish and Polish victims of the regime, he coldly stated that all Jews and Poles were bad, that Germany had simply cleansed its society by putting them into camps, and that the Allies had made a mistake by releasing them. He even argued that the United States government was foolish for not incorporating the SS into the American military to fight against the Soviet Union. In July 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 46 of the defendants, including Joachim Peiper, were sentenced to death by hanging. The rest received long prison terms or life imprisonment. It seemed that justice had been served, that the butchers of Malmedy would finally pay for their crimes. But the trajectory of history is rarely straightforward. As the late 1940s transitioned into the 1950s, the geopolitical landscape changed dramatically. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed, giving way to the Cold War. West Germany was now a critical, strategic ally for the West. Against the threat of communism, the American government needed the cooperation of the German public and the rebuilding of the German military. In this new political environment, the appetite for prosecuting German war criminals rapidly diminished. The convicted SS men launched a sophisticated legal campaign, claiming that their post-war confessions had been obtained through unlawful methods. Psychological pressure and physical torture by American interrogators, nationalist groups in Germany, and sympathetic politicians in the United States took up their cause, casting doubt on the validity of the Dachau trials. Under intense political pressure, American judicial reviewers began to commute the sentences. In 1951, Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. A few years later, it was reduced further. On December 22, 1956, just 12 years after the fields of Malmedy ran red with American blood, Joachim Peiper walked out of prison a free man. The justice system had blinked. Upon his release, Peiper attempted to reintegrate into German society. He secured a high-paying job at the Porsche Automobile Company, but his past refused to stay hidden. Italian trade unions and former resistance members discovered his employment and launched massive protests, refusing to work alongside a man responsible for the slaughter of innocent civilians. In Bavs and Malmedy, Porsche, fearing a catastrophic loss of sales in the lucrative American market, was forced to dismiss him, realizing he was a pariah in his own country. Peiper and his wife moved to a quiet, secluded house in the small village of Treves in eastern France. In 1972, he assumed a low profile, working as a self-employed translator of military history books. He believed that he had paid his debt to society, that 12 years in prison had wiped his slate clean. He lived under his real name, confident that the world had forgotten the Blowtorch Battalion. He was wrong. In June 1976, anti fascist political activists discovered his presence in France. They distributed flyers throughout the local community, revealing that the quiet old German man living in their midst was actually a high-ranking Nazi war criminal, responsible for massacres of civilians and prisoners of war. The news spread like wildfire, attracting journalists and investigators to his property. Instead of hiding or showing remorse, Peiper reacted with characteristic arrogance. In interviews with the French press, he portrayed himself as a victim of communist harassment. He insulted the French nation, stating that in 1940, the French people had been cowards who refused to fight, which is why Germany had conquered them so easily. These insulting remarks provoked intense fury among the local residents and the national French press. The ghosts of his past had finally caught up with him. On the night of July 14th, 1976, Bastille Day, the national celebration of French freedom, a group of unidentified vigilantes calling themselves the Avengers surrounded Peiper's house. They cut his telephone lines, blocked the roads, and threw firebombs through the windows of his home. The building erupted into a massive inferno. The man who had ordered the burning of villages in Russia, who had watched patients suffocate in gas chambers, and who had burned the parish priest of Bavs alive was caught in his own trap. Joachim Peiper died inside that burning house, suffocated by smoke and consumed by the flames. When investigators cleared the rubble the following day, they discovered a body that had shrunk to a fraction of its normal size due to the extreme heat. A neighbor who viewed the remains remarked that it was him, but he had been miniaturized by the fire. There were no tears shed for Joachim Peiper. The story of Nazi war crimes is not a comfortable one. It does not offer easy answers or a clean moral resolution. It forces us to confront a terrifying truth. That's the line between a civilized human being and a mass murderer is dangerously thin. The men who committed these massacres were not a separate species of monsters. They were ordinary men who allowed themselves to be consumed by an ideology of hatred, who surrendered their personal conscience to the collective will of the state, and who viewed empathy as a weakness. When we look back at the horrors of the Second World War, we must realize that these atrocities did not begin with gas chambers or mass executions. They began with words. They began with political myths, with the demonization of minorities, and with the gradual erosion of the moral principles that protect the vulnerable. The moment we accept the idea that some human lives are worth less than others, the moment we look away from injustice because it is politically convenient, we take the first step on the road that leads to Malmedy, to Bobby Yar, and to Buvs. The ashes of history are cold, but they contain a warning that is eternally alive. We must remember the victims not just out of pity, but out of necessity. We must study the killers not to understand their madness, but to recognize the potential for that same madness within ourselves. Because the machinery of death is always waiting, and the only thing required for it to start running again is for ordinary people to remain silent.